A black trauma surgeon was shoved aside by a police officer who refused to believe she was a doctor, despite her badge and credentials. Officer Derek Martinez not only disrespected her with cruel skepticism, but dismissed her with the dehumanizing words, "Maybe if you people didn't have an attitude, things would go smoother." Minutes later, that same officer was rushed into her operating room, bleeding and unconscious, his life now entirely in her hands. But just listen to how shocking the turn of events in this drama was, and why Justice ultimately, Dr. Maya Williams, pushed through the automatic doors of Mercy General's emergency room, her Navy scrubs still crisp despite the 14-hour shift she'd just pulled. The familiar scent of antiseptic mixed with the metallic tang of the trauma bay greeted her as the fluorescent lights hummed overhead. She made her way toward the nurse's station, her mind already running through the post-op notes she needed to complete before she could finally head home. The teenager she'd operated on tonight, 17-year-old Marcus Thompson, would live to see his graduation because her hands had been steady, because her training had been thorough, because she'd refused to give up when the internal bleeding seemed impossible to control. Maya could still feel the ghost of the surgical instruments in her fingers, the weight of responsibility that came with holding someone's life in your hands. It never got easier, but it always mattered. Exhaustion was beginning to creep into her bones, that particular heaviness that came after hours of intense concentration and physical strain. Her shoulders ached from being hunched over the operating table, and her feet throbbed despite the comfortable sneakers she always wore during long shifts. She was looking forward to peeling off these scrubs, taking a hot shower, and collapsing into bed. Just 30 more minutes of paperwork, she told herself. Then freedom. "Excuse me," she said softly, trying to squeeze past a uniformed police officer who was blocking the corridor, his broad shoulders taking up most of the narrow space between the wall and a supply cart. Officer Derek Martinez didn't move. He was mid-conversation with another officer, laughing loudly about something, his hand resting casually on his belt. The sound of their laughter echoed off the sterile walls, out of place in the usually hushed environment of the hospital corridor. Maya waited a moment, assuming he simply hadn't heard her over his own voice. "Sorry, I need to get through," she repeated, a bit louder this time. Martinez glanced back, his eyes sweeping over her dismissively, taking in her scrubs, her face, making some calculation she'd seen 1,000 times before. His expression didn't change, didn't register her as anything important or worthy of his attention. "Wait your turn," he said, his tone flat and final, before turning back to his conversation as if she'd already ceased to exist. Maya felt her jaw tighten. She'd been a surgeon for 8 years, had graduated top of her class from Johns Hopkins, had hands that had saved countless lives in operating rooms across 3 states. She'd published research papers, mentored residents, won awards. But in this moment, in this hallway, standing in her scrubs after saving a child's life, she was invisible. Or worse, she was something to be dismissed. She took a breath, steadying herself. "I'm a doctor," she said, her voice firmer now, professional but insistent. "I need to access the nurse's station to complete patient charts." Martinez finally turned fully, his eyes narrowing as he looked her up and down with deliberate slowness. There was something in his gaze that made her skin prickle, skepticism mixed with something darker, something that said he'd already decided who she was and what she was worth. "Sure you are," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm that cut through the air like a scalpel. "Look, whatever you're here for, you can wait like everyone else. Hospital's busy. I don't care." Maya opened her mouth to respond, to point out her badge, to explain, but before the words could form, Martinez placed his hand on her shoulder and shoved her backward. Not hard enough to make her fall, but enough. Enough to make her stumble, enough to send her back 2 steps, enough to make every person in that corridor turn and stare. Enough to make it clear this was intentional, a message wrapped in the guise of crowd control. "Step back," he said coldly, his voice carrying the weight of authority he'd learned to wield like a weapon. The shock of it froze Maya in place. The physical contact, the casual dismissal, the public humiliation, it hit her in waves. She could feel her heart hammering against her ribs, could feel the heat rising to her face, a mixture of anger and embarrassment and disbelief. Around them, nurses had stopped moving. Other staff members had gone silent. Everyone was watching this moment unfold, witnessing her degradation, and she could see the recognition in their eyes. They knew who she was. They knew what had just happened. And in their faces, she saw her own shock reflected back at her. Nurse Jennifer Chen rushed forward immediately, her face tight with concern. "Officer Martinez, that's Dr. Williams. She's the head of our trauma surgery department." The words hung in the air like a challenge. For a brief second, Martinez's expression flickered, something between embarrassment and irritation, as if being corrected by a civilian, especially a woman of color, was an insult in itself. But the moment passed. He didn't apologize. Instead, he shrugged, a dismissive roll of his shoulders that carried the weight of indifference. "She should wear her badge, then," he said, his voice low, but loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Would have saved us all the confusion." Maya felt the absurdity of it like a punch to the chest. Her badge, her name, her credentials, her title, was clipped clearly to her scrub pocket, just as it had been for every shift over the past 8 years. Dr. Maya Williams, M.D., F.A.C.S., Trauma Surgery. The letters stood for years of sacrifice, excellence, and service. And yet, to him, it meant nothing. His assumption had been instant, automatic. She didn't belong, she wasn't credible, she was just another person in scrubs who needed to wait her turn. "I am wearing my badge," Maya said, her voice steady despite the tremor beneath it. She gestured to the ID, holding it up so there could be no doubt. "Right here." Martinez's jaw clenched. His eyes darted to the badge, then back to her face, as if seeing her for the first time, and not liking what he found. His partner, Officer Rodriguez, touched his arm lightly. "Man, let's just—" he started, his tone cautious, almost apologetic. "Whatever," Martinez cut him off, his voice sharp. He turned back to Maya, his gaze hardening. "Maybe if you people didn't always have an attitude, things would go smoother." "You people." The words landed like a slap, not just because of what they implied, but because of the ease with which they were spoken. The casual dehumanization, the sweeping generalization that erased her individuality, her achievements, her very personhood. In that moment, she wasn't Dr. Williams, the surgeon who had just saved a life. She was a stereotype, a category, a problem to be managed. Maya opened her mouth to respond, but Jennifer's hand was already on her arm, gentle, urgent, grounding. "Dr. Williams," she said, her voice low but firm, "your post-op patient in room 3 needs you. Vitals are spiking. It was an escape route, and Maya took it." She straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin, and walked past Martinez without another word. She could feel his eyes on her back, could hear the low murmur of his voice as he said something to his partner, something that made them both chuckle. She didn't look back. She wouldn't give him that satisfaction. In the quiet of the supply closet down the hall, Maya leaned against the cool cinder-block wall and let herself breathe. The sterile scent of gauze and antiseptic filled her lungs, but it did nothing to calm the storm inside. Her hands trembled slightly as she pressed them against her thighs. 8 years of medical school, 4 years of grueling residency, countless nights without sleep, studying, operating, comforting families, pushing through exhaustion and doubt. Lives saved, awards earned, respect earned, everywhere but here, in this moment, in this hallway. And still, she had been reduced to nothing more than the color of her skin. Jennifer found her 5 minutes later, slipping quietly into the closet and closing the door behind her. "Maya," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion, "I'm so sorry. I've already filed a report with security and hospital administration. That was completely unacceptable." Maya nodded, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. "It's not the first time, Jen," she said quietly. "It won't be the last." Jennifer's expression tightened. "That doesn't make it okay." "No," Maya agreed, her voice barely above a whisper. "It doesn't." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the unspoken truth settling between them. This wasn't just about one officer. It wasn't just about one moment. It was about a pattern, a system, a world that too often refused to see her, really see her, for who she was. But Maya knew one thing with absolute certainty. She wouldn't let it break her. She would keep walking, keep healing, keep rising, because every time she stepped into that OR, she proved them. 2 hours later, Maya sat in the dim glow of the radiology reading room, her eyes scanning the high-resolution CT images on the monitor. The soft hum of the computer and the occasional click of the mouse were the only sounds in the otherwise quiet space. She was reviewing the abdominal scans of her post-op patient, confirming the success of the earlier surgery, when the overhead intercom crackled to life. "Code trauma, level 1, adult male, gunshot wounds to the chest and abdomen, ETA 3 minutes. Dr. Williams to Trauma Bay 1. The words snapped her into action. Maya was on her feet before the announcement finished, the fatigue of the long shift momentarily erased by the surge of adrenaline. She moved with purpose, her mind shifting instantly into the focused calm that had been drilled into her through years of training. The emotional weight of the earlier confrontation, the sting of humiliation, it all receded, compartmentalized. In this moment, she wasn't Maya Williams, the woman who had been shoved and demeaned. She was Dr. Williams, trauma surgeon, and a life was on the line. The ambulance bay doors burst open with a metallic clang. Paramedics rushed in, wheels squealing against the linoleum as they wheeled in a gurney. A man lay strapped down, his uniform soaked in blood, the fabric dark and heavy around 2 distinct wounds, one high on the right chest, the other just below the rib cage on the left side. The lead paramedic was already shouting vital signs. "Gunshot wounds, right hemithorax and upper left quadrant, BP 80/50, and dropping, tachycardic at 130, oxygen saturation at 88%. He's losing consciousness fast." Maya stepped forward, her hands already reaching for the patient, her eyes scanning the injuries with clinical precision. She assessed airway, breathing, circulation, her training taking over, her instincts guiding her. Then, as she leaned closer to check his pupils, she saw his face. Officer Derek Martinez. For a fraction of a second, the world seemed to stop. The noise of the ER faded. The beeping monitors, the shouted instructions, the rush of footsteps, all of it blurred into silence. Her breath caught in her throat. This was the man who had dismissed her, touched her without consent, spoken to her with contempt less than 2 hours ago. And now he was here, bleeding, vulnerable, his life slipping away. His eyes were half open, glazed with pain and shock. But when they focused on her face, recognition flashed across his features, and then fear. "No," he mumbled, his voice weak, his hand twitching upward as if to push her away. "Not her. I don't want her." Dr. James Chen, the ER attending, stepped forward, his voice firm but urgent. "Officer Martinez, Dr. Williams is the best trauma surgeon in the state. You've sustained critical injuries. You need surgery now, or you won't make it. This isn't about preference. It's about survival." "I don't—" Martinez tried again, but his words dissolved into a wet cough. A thin line of blood appeared at the corner of his mouth, a sign of internal bleeding, possibly from the lung. Maya's mind raced, but her hands remained steady. She thought of her oath, the words she'd recited on graduation day. "I will apply, for the benefit of the sick, all measures that are required, without regard to their personal attributes." She thought of every patient she'd ever treated, strangers, criminals, heroes, the beloved and the forgotten. Each one had deserved her skill. Each one had received it. And so would he. She straightened, her voice cutting through the controlled chaos of the trauma bay, clear and commanding. "Get him to OR2. Type and cross for 8 units of blood, call anesthesia now, and prep for an exploratory laparotomy. I need the surgical team in 5 minutes. Move. No hesitation. No delay." The machinery of emergency care sprang into motion. The gurney rolled forward, the paramedics and nurses moving in practiced unison. Maya walked beside him, her eyes never leaving the patient, not as an enemy, not as a symbol, but as a human being in crisis, because in that moment there was only one truth that mattered. He needed her, and she would not fail him. In the operating room, under the harsh white lights that cast no shadows and allowed no mistakes, Officer Derek Martinez was no longer the man who had shoved her. He was no longer the officer who had questioned her identity, her worth, her place. He was a patient, just another body on the table, pale, still, vulnerable. A collection of organs, vessels, and tissues that needed to be repaired, nothing more, nothing less. Dr. Maya Williams stood at the head of the surgical field, her hands gloved and steady, her focus absolute. The rhythmic beep of the heart monitor filled the room, a fragile soundtrack to the life hanging in the balance. Her scalpel made the first incision with precision, guided by years of training, instinct, and an unshakable commitment to her purpose. Her eyes scanned the internal damage. The bullet had torn through muscle and tissue, nicking the pulmonary artery, a millimeter deeper, and he would have bled out before reaching the hospital. The second wound had perforated the upper left abdomen, threatening the spleen and surrounding vasculature. If she'd been 5 minutes later, he wouldn't have survived. If she'd been anyone less skilled, less experienced, less calm under pressure, he would have died on this table. "Suction," she said calmly, her voice steady, her gaze never leaving the surgical field. "I need better visualization here." The team responded instantly. A nurse handed her instruments, the anesthesiologist called out vitals, and the circulating nurse documented every step. Around her, the surgical team moved in silent coordination, trusting her judgment, following her lead. There was no room for emotion, no space for personal history. Only the work mattered. The surgery took 4 hours, 4 hours of meticulous repair, tying off bleeders, suturing damaged tissue, restoring what had been torn apart. Every decision was deliberate, every movement calculated. Maya didn't rush. She didn't hesitate. She simply did what needed to be done. When it was over, when Martinez's vitals had stabilized and he was wheeled into recovery, Maya stepped back. She peeled off her gloves, her shoulders heavy with exhaustion, and walked out of the OR. The adrenaline that had carried her through began to fade, replaced by the deep, bone-tired ache of a shift that had stretched far beyond its limits. Jennifer was waiting in the hallway, her eyes searching Maya's face. "He's going to make it," Maya said, her voice quiet but firm. Jennifer's eyes welled with tears. "Maya, after what he did to you—" "I know," Maya interrupted, leaning against the cool wall, suddenly feeling every ounce of the past 18 hours. "But that's not who I am." "I don't get to choose which lives matter. I took an oath." 3 days later, Maya was making her morning rounds when she reached Martinez's room. He was awake, propped up in bed, his face pale but alert. When she entered, he flinched, just slightly, but she saw it. The weight of what he'd done, of what he'd said, hung in the air between them. "I need to check your incision," she said, her tone professional, her movements gentle as she examined the healing wound. Martinez remained silent, his eyes fixed on her hands, hands that had saved his life. When she finished and turned to leave, his voice stopped her. "Dr. Williams." She turned. His eyes were red-rimmed, his voice barely above a whisper. "They told me what you did." "How bad it was," they said. He swallowed hard. "They said anyone else would have let me die." Maya met his gaze steadily. "I'm not anyone else." "I was wrong," he said, the words seeming to cost him everything. "What I did, what I said, I was—" His voice cracked. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." She stood there for a long moment, looking at this man who had dismissed her, reduced her, treated her as less than human. And yet she had treated him as more than his worst moment. "I hope you remember this," she said quietly. "I hope you remember that when you saw me in that hallway, you saw a threat. But when I saw you on that table, I saw a human being. That's the difference between us, Officer Martinez, and I hope to God you spend the rest of your life trying to understand it." She walked out without waiting for a response. Behind her, through the closing door, she heard him crying. Maya didn't feel triumphant. She felt tired, sad, and yet, somehow, lighter. Justice, she realized, wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was quiet. It was showing up. It was doing the right thing when no one would blame you for doing otherwise. As she walked down the corridor, Jennifer fell into step beside her. "You're incredible. You know that?" Maya managed a small smile. "I'm just doing my job." "No," Jennifer said firmly. "You're changing hearts." One surgery at